My name is Lana Roman, and I've been Electron Industries lead grid engineer for 8 years. 8 years of building systems, analyzing vulnerabilities, and yes, warning people about catastrophic failures they refuse to see coming. 8 years of watching corporate ambition clash with engineering reality, and losing that battle more often than I care to remember. I grew up in this city. My father worked construction on the original power infrastructure in the 1980s, came home every night with stories about the massive transformers and switching stations that kept our lights on. He'd sketch diagrams on napkins during dinner, explaining how electricity flowed through the veins of the city like blood through arteries. Respect the power, Lana, he'd say, but never fear understanding it. That philosophy carried me through MIT, through my master's degree in electrical engineering, through the early years at Electron Industries when I was still naive enough to believe that good data and sound reasoning would always win arguments. Before I learned that boardrooms operate on different physics than electrical systems. The memory burns fresh like a circuit overload. Conference Room 12A, that sterile temple of corporate decision-making with its mahogany table gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights, abstract art worth more than most people's annual salaries hanging on cream-colored walls, and 7 board members in expensive suits staring at my presentation like I'd just suggested we power the city with hamster wheels. I remember the weight of the laser pointer in my hand, how it trembled slightly as I clicked through slide after slide of data they didn't want to hear. The room smelled of leather chairs and expensive cologne, a sharp contrast to the industrial smell of transformers and copper wire I'd grown accustomed to in the field. These people lived in a world of quarterly reports and profit margins. I lived in a world of load calculations and thermal limits. The Phase 3 expansion is fundamentally flawed, I'd said, my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach. I clicked through slides of load calculations and failure probability matrices, each graph more damning than the last. The numbers told a story of impending disaster that anyone with basic engineering knowledge should have understood. We're pushing too much capacity through outdated infrastructure. The Westfield substation was installed in 1987, it's running on technology older than some of our interns. The transformers can't handle this surge. We need 6 months minimum for proper reinforcement, probably closer to 8 if we want to do it right. I paused, scanning their faces for any sign of comprehension. Board member Gerald Foster was checking his phone. Victoria Walsh was doodling on her notepad. Only Chief Financial Officer Robert Kane seemed to be paying attention, but his expression suggested he was calculating costs rather than considering consequences. Chairman Gregory Blackstone, silver-haired, Harvard MBA, never worked a day in actual engineering, leaned back in his leather chair with that practiced smirk I'd grown to despise. The same smirk he'd worn when he'd dismissed my warnings about the East Side substation 2 years ago. That one had only cost us $3 million when it failed. This one would be worse. Much worse. Lana, you're too negative for innovation. We can't let fear of hypothetical problems delay progress. The city needs power expansion now, not next year. Hypothetical problems. The words still taste bitter, like pennies in my mouth. I remember the exact inflection he used, the casual dismissiveness that relegated my months of analysis to mere speculation. This wasn't speculation. This was engineering reality distilled into hard numbers and unavoidable physics. I tried again, pulling up the thermal analysis graphs. The red zones were unmistakable, temperatures that would melt copper, overload protection systems, cascade through the entire network like a virus. Sir, with respect, these aren't hypothetical. The stress analysis clearly shows transformer degradation under sustained loads above 85% capacity. Westfield has been running at 82% during peak hours. Phase 3 will push it to 127%. That's not sustainable. It's not even safe. The stress analysis shows possibilities, not certainties. Board member Patricia Vance cut me off, her manicured fingers drumming impatiently on the polished table surface. Her wedding ring caught the light, probably worth more than the safety upgrades I was recommending. We've invested $14 million in this timeline. The mayor's office is breathing down our necks about rolling blackouts last summer. The public demands reliable power expansion. We can't keep delaying progress for worst-case scenarios that might never happen. We go live Monday. Monday. Today was Wednesday. 5 business days to implement a system I knew would fail spectacularly. 5 days to watch them rush installations that should take months, bypass safety protocols I'd spent years developing, ignore every principle of responsible engineering I'd ever learned. I stayed silent after that exchange, but my mind was racing. What else could I do? I'd presented the data with scientific precision. I'd highlighted the risks with mathematical certainty. I'd offered solutions backed by decades of industry best practices. They'd made their choice based on quarterly earnings projections and political pressures, not physics and safety margins. The meeting ended with handshakes and confident smiles. Blackstone actually clapped me on the shoulder as we filed out. "Lana, I appreciate your thoroughness," he said, as if I were a child who'd shown her homework. "But sometimes you have to trust that experience and intuition matter as much as calculations. We've been in this business for 40 years. We know what we're doing." 40 years of business experience. Against 30 years of electrical engineering principles that hadn't changed since Edison and Tesla. The arrogance was breathtaking. So I did what any rational engineer would do, what my father had taught me to do when construction supervisors ignored safety protocols. I documented everything with the meticulousness of someone building a legal case, because I knew that's exactly what this would become. Every email warning of potential cascade failures, timestamped and copied to my personal account. Every risk assessment showing critical vulnerabilities, printed and filed in my home office. Every proposed solution they dismissed as unnecessarily cautious, saved with their dismissive responses attached. I created a folder on my secure drive labeled CYA, cover your ass, and filled it with months of evidence that I'd done everything possible to prevent the disaster I could see coming like a freight train in slow motion. 5 days of watching them rush installations that should have taken months. 5 days of watching union electricians work double shifts to meet impossible deadlines, their faces grim with the knowledge that corners were being cut. 5 days of seeing safety protocols bypassed with executive overrides, my carefully designed inspection procedures reduced to rubber stamps. I spent Wednesday night at the Westfield substation with Carlos Martinez, our senior field technician. Carlos had been installing transformers since before I was born, had the kind of intuitive understanding of electrical systems that comes from decades of hands-on experience. We stood in the switchyard under harsh sodium lights, listening to the hum of transformers already straining under existing load. Sunday night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at ceiling shadows cast by street lights, running calculations in my head like a broken record. The numbers were unforgiving, mathematical certainties that board meetings couldn't negotiate away. At 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely and drove to the office through empty streets, the city peaceful in the darkness that would soon become chaos. The Electron Industries building stood 40 stories tall in the financial district, its glass facade reflecting the sparse traffic below. I used my keycard to access the engineering floors, walked through cubicles empty except for the ghosts of rushed decisions and ignored warnings. In my office, I pulled up the load forecasting software and ran the numbers one final time, hoping against engineering logic that I'd made an error. The math was unforgiving, as precise and inevitable as gravity. Peak load would hit Tuesday afternoon when air conditioning systems across the city ramped up to battle the forecasted heat wave. The Westfield substation would overload at approximately 2:45 p.m. Cascade failure would follow within minutes as automated systems attempted to reroute power through infrastructure already operating at maximum capacity. I watched the simulation run on my computer screen, red warning lights spreading across the grid diagram like an infection, each failed node triggering additional failures in a domino effect I could predict down to the minute. The computer model showed a total system collapse affecting 47,000 customers across 6 district zones. Economic losses in the tens of millions. Emergency services overwhelmed. Hospitals switching to backup power. I sent one last email to Blackstone at 3:47 a.m., my fingers trembling slightly as I typed. Subject line: Urgent immediate shutdown required, legal liability warning. I detailed the exact failure sequence with timestamps, predicted the cascade pattern with node-by-node breakdown, estimated damage in both human and financial terms. I attached thermal analysis reports, load calculation spreadsheets, historical failure data from similar incidents. Sent copies to the entire board, the City Utilities Commission, our insurance company, and, in a moment of desperate inspiration, the local investigative news team that had covered our East Side substation failure 2 years ago. His response came back within minutes, the timestamp showing 3:52 a.m. Either he never slept, or he had alerts set up for emails from problem employees like me. Lana, your pessimism is noted and frankly becoming disruptive to company morale. System goes live as scheduled per board directive. Consider this your final warning about undermining company decisions and spreading panic among staff. We have full confidence in our systems and timeline. Final warning. The irony was devastating. He was giving me a final warning about giving him final warnings. Tuesday morning arrived with temperatures already climbing toward what meteorologists were calling a dangerous heat index. The kind of day when air conditioners across the city would strain to keep buildings cool, creating exactly the peak demand scenario I'd warned about. I arrived at the office early, my stomach knotted with anticipation and dread. The morning briefing was routine, status updates on the Phase 3 launch, congratulations being passed around for meeting the impossible timeline. Blackstone looked particularly satisfied, probably already composing his press release about Electron Industries' commitment to innovative power solutions. I sat through the meeting in silence, checking my watch every few minutes. By noon, the temperature had reached 94 degrees. By 1 p.m., it was 97. The grid monitoring station showed increasing load across all sectors as office buildings and residential areas cranked up their cooling systems. 2:30 p.m. Load approaching critical thresholds. I stood at the main monitoring station on the 4th floor, surrounded by banks of computers displaying real-time grid status. Other engineers were focused on routine maintenance alerts and minor fluctuations. None of them seemed to notice the slow building crisis unfolding on every screen. 2:40 p.m. Westfield substation showing sustained load at 89% capacity and climbing. The transformer temperatures were already into the orange warning zone. I picked up the phone to call the control room, then set it down. What was the point? They'd dismiss my concerns just like the board had. 2:45 p.m. Load hit 95%. Temperature readings went red. 2:47 p.m. I was calibrating sensors, trying to distract myself from watching the inevitable unfold, when the building's lights flickered. That subtle dimming that tells every engineer's trained eye that something major just failed somewhere in the system. My stomach dropped like I was in a falling elevator. I sprinted to the monitoring station, pushed past confused technicians, and pulled up the grid status display. Red warnings cascaded across every screen like digital blood. Critical alerts flashing, alarm bells triggering, automatic systems screaming electronic warnings that no human could process fast enough to stop what was already in motion. Westfield substation showed critical overload, exactly as I'd predicted, exactly when I'd predicted it, exactly how I'd predicted it would happen. "What the hell is going on?" shouted Mike Patterson, our shift supervisor, as he ran up behind me. His 20 years of experience had never prepared him for watching a third of the city lose power in real time. "Cascade failure," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the chaos around us. "Starting at Westfield, spreading through the network exactly as modeled." 2:48 p.m. Westfield main transformer offline. The computer systems were already attempting automatic load rerouting, following protocols I'd helped design years ago when we still believed the board would listen to engineering recommendations. 2:49 p.m. Load automatically shifted to Riverside Station. But Riverside was already running at 78% capacity on a normal day. The sudden additional load from Westfield's failure pushed it past its own thermal limits instantly. 2:50 p.m. Riverside protection systems triggered, taking that station offline to prevent permanent equipment damage. Smart systems protecting themselves from human stupidity, but creating bigger problems in the process. 2:51 p.m. Load rerouted again, this time to Central Station. Central's aging transformers, installed during the Clinton administration, simply couldn't handle the sudden surge. I watched the temperature readings spike beyond the red zone into ranges that meant copper was literally melting inside the transformer cores. 2:52 p.m. Central tripped offline. By 2:55 p.m., 6 substations were down and the domino effect was accelerating. The automated systems were following their programming perfectly, trying to keep the lights on by rerouting power through infrastructure that couldn't handle it. Each rerouting created another overload, another failure, another cascade. 47,000 homes and businesses without power, exactly as I'd calculated. Traffic lights dead at major intersections, creating gridlock that would trap emergency vehicles. Hospitals switching to backup generators, their critical systems suddenly dependent on diesel fuel and prayer. Emergency services overwhelmed with elevator rescues, alarm system failures, and traffic accidents at darkened intersections. The monitoring station had gone from routine background hum to frantic activity. Engineers and technicians scrambled to implement emergency protocols, their faces pale with the realization that the impossible was happening. The kind of system-wide failure that wasn't supposed to occur in modern power grids, prevented by multiple layers of safety systems and careful planning. Except we hadn't been careful. We'd been rushed. I stood there watching my worst nightmare unfold on those screens, feeling simultaneously vindicated and sickened by the accuracy of my predictions. This was exactly what I'd warned them about. Exactly the sequence I'd modeled. Exactly the disaster I'd begged them to prevent. The physics didn't care about board decisions or project timelines. Electricity followed laws that couldn't be negotiated with or dismissed as pessimistic speculation. The chaos lasted 17 minutes before emergency protocols finally stabilized the remaining grid. 17 minutes of complete power failure across half the metropolitan area. 17 minutes of modern urban civilization grinding to a halt because 7 people in expensive suits had decided that engineering warnings were negotiable suggestions rather than mathematical certainties. During those 17 minutes, I found myself thinking about my father, about those napkin sketches he'd drawn during family dinners. Respect the power, Lana, but never fear understanding it. I understood it perfectly. I'd tried to make them understand it too. But understanding and respecting are different things entirely. When the emergency systems finally kicked in and began the slow process of restoring power grid by grid, zone by zone, I walked to my office window and looked out at a city partially in darkness. Street lights were out for blocks. Office buildings stood like dark monuments against the afternoon sky. In the distance, I could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles converging on areas where critical infrastructure had failed. My phone started ringing. Local news stations. The mayor's office. Federal oversight agencies. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, who was responsible, how this could have occurred in a city with supposedly modern electrical infrastructure. I let them go to voicemail. I knew they'd all receive copies of my email warnings within hours. The investigation teams would have access to months of documented evidence showing exactly who had been responsible, not for the failure, but for ignoring the warnings that could have prevented it. Now, 2 hours later, my office door exploded open with the violence of people who'd just realized their careers might be over. Blackstone stormed in, his silver hair disheveled, his face purple with rage and what might have been panic. Behind him came 3 other board members, Vance, Foster, and Kane, followed by what looked like a battalion of corporate lawyers in dark suits carrying briefcases and wearing expressions of barely controlled damage control. The smell of their expensive cologne mixed with the electrical burn odor drifting in from outside, creating an olfactory cocktail of corporate desperation and industrial disaster. Vance's perfectly styled hair was showing stress-induced disarray, and Foster's usual confidence had been replaced by the wild-eyed look of a man watching his retirement portfolio evaporate in real time. Why was half the city allowed to go dark? Blackstone shouted, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. He jabbed his finger at me like I was personally responsible for the laws of physics. Costing millions in fines? Emergency response costs? Business interruption lawsuits? What the hell happened to your systems? My systems. That phrase encapsulated everything wrong with corporate thinking about engineering. These weren't my systems any more than gravity was Newton's personal property. These were engineered systems operating according to predictable physical laws that I'd studied, analyzed, and reported on with mathematical precision. I turned slowly from the window where I'd been watching emergency crews work to restore power, their cherry pickers and flood lights creating an industrial ballet of crisis response. Fire trucks, police cars, and utility vehicles filled the streets below like antibodies responding to an infection. The city was wounded, and it would take days to fully heal from injuries that could have been prevented with 6 months of proper planning. My systems worked exactly as I predicted they would, Mr. Blackstone, I said, my voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I warned you this would happen. Multiple times. In writing. With mathematical precision. I predicted the failure sequence, the timing, and the scope of the damage. The only surprise here is that you're surprised. You're the lead grid engineer. Vance shrieked from behind him, her voice pitched high with panic. You're responsible for grid stability. This is your fault. Your negligence. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the burned transformers outside. Negligence. The legal term that could define careers, destroy reputations, and shift liability from corporate boardrooms to individual engineers. I'd been expecting this moment since Sunday night, had prepared for it with the methodical care of someone who understood that truth and blame weren't always aligned in corporate America. I walked to my desk with deliberate calm, opened my laptop with the practiced motion of someone about to present evidence rather than make excuses. The laptop screen glowed with saved folders containing months of documentation, a digital paper trail that told the story of ignored warnings and dismissed expertise. I pulled up the email thread that would either vindicate my warnings or destroy my career, though at this point, I suspected both outcomes might be the same thing. I'm responsible for analyzing grid stability and recommending appropriate actions based on engineering principles and safety standards, I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years studying electrical systems rather than stock portfolios. I did that job thoroughly, professionally, and with mathematical precision. What I'm not responsible for is the board's decision to ignore those recommendations in favor of arbitrary timelines and political pressures. What I'm not responsible for is corporate management treating engineering warnings as negotiable suggestions rather than physical laws. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the distant sound of diesel generators and emergency vehicle sirens. The lawyers were already shifting into damage control mode, their expressions showing the calculated alertness of people trying to determine which way the liability would fall. One of them, a sharp-featured woman with gray hair, was taking notes with the intensity of someone building either a prosecution or a defense case. Blackstone's face had gone from purple to an interesting shade of gray as realization began to dawn. Corporate executives were skilled at reading spreadsheets and market trends, but the mathematics of legal liability was apparently translating clearly enough for him to understand that his position was rapidly becoming untenable. "Show me," he said quietly, his voice lacking the bluster and confidence he'd displayed just moments before. I turned the laptop screen toward them, angling it so the entire group could see the damning evidence displayed in chronological order. Email after email scrolled past like frames in a film documenting institutional negligence. Warning after warning, each one more urgent than the last. Recommendation after recommendation, each one dismissed with increasing irritation. Their own responses, casual and dismissive, treating engineering calculations like inconvenient opinions rather than mathematical facts. "Here's my initial analysis from 6 weeks ago identifying the Westfield vulnerability," I said, clicking to highlight the relevant message with its detailed thermal calculations and load projections. Complete with transformer specifications, load calculations, and historical failure data from similar installations. "Here's my recommendation for infrastructure upgrades, including specific equipment requirements and implementation timelines. And here's your response, Mr. Blackstone, calling it unnecessarily expensive and disruptive to our aggressive expansion schedule." The room's atmosphere had shifted from accusatory anger to uncomfortable recognition. Foster was staring at his shoes. Kane was studying the ceiling as if it contained fascinating architectural details. Vance's face had gone pale beneath her makeup, the reality of documented evidence apparently more persuasive than righteous indignation. "Here's my analysis from 6 weeks ago identifying the Westfield vulnerability," I said, clicking to the relevant message. "Here's my recommendation for infrastructure upgrades. Here's your response calling it unnecessarily expensive. Here's my warning about cascade failure scenarios. Your response called it pessimistic fearmongering." The lawyers were scribbling frantically in their notepads. One of them whispered urgently to Blackstone, probably explaining just how thoroughly screwed they were from a liability standpoint. "And here," I continued, pulling up Sunday's email, "is my final warning, sent 36 hours ago, predicting exactly what happened today. Down to the timing and sequence of failures." I spun the laptop back around, closed it with a satisfying click. "The city is currently without power not because I failed to warn you, but because you failed to listen. The investigation team will have these emails within the hour. So will the media. So will the Federal Grid Oversight Commission." Blackstone sank into the chair across from my desk, looking suddenly much older than his 62 years. The weight of $14 million in immediate losses, plus however many millions more in fines and lawsuits, seemed to be settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. What did I want? Justice, I suppose. Accountability. Recognition that engineering warnings exist for reasons beyond mere pessimism. "I want a formal apology to every family whose medical equipment went offline today," I said. "I want immediate implementation of every safety recommendation I've made in the past year. I want final approval authority on all grid modifications. And I want your promise that this company will never again prioritize politics over engineering reality." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of generators and emergency vehicles. Through my window, I could see work crews frantically installing temporary transformers, racing to restore power before nightfall brought additional chaos. "Done," Blackstone said finally. But it wasn't about power dynamics or corporate politics anymore. It was about the fundamental question that had haunted me since 2:47 p.m. How many warnings does it take before someone listens? The answer, apparently, is one catastrophic failure. I thought about all the times I'd second-guessed myself over the years. Wondered if I was being too cautious, too negative, too focused on worst-case scenarios. Standing here now, watching the aftermath of ignored warnings play out across half the city, I realized something important. Being right about disaster prevention isn't pessimism. It's responsibility. The board filed out quietly, leaving me alone with my vindication and the weight of knowing this catastrophe was entirely preventable. Tomorrow, I'll start rebuilding the grid correctly. Tonight, I'll sleep soundly for the first time in weeks. Sometimes being proven right is the worst kind of victory. But it's still victory. The power will come back on. It always does. The question is whether we'll learn enough from the darkness to prevent it from happening again. I'm not optimistic. But I'll keep warning them anyway. Because that's what engineers do. We see problems. We solve problems. And we document everything for when the inevitable happens. The sirens are finally quieting outside. Power is slowly returning block by block. And somewhere in those mahogany conference rooms, people are finally reading my emails. Too late, but finally.